Okay, so good afternoon, and thank you for joining us this lunchtime for our lunchtime chat about everything US and tariffs and de minimis and FDA regulations. I'm very pleased to be joined by Jim from the Opal Group. It's very early there this morning, so we welcome him, and also Gary Bayliss from Registrar Corp they'll be doing a couple of presentations for us today. I'm sure some of you will have some questions about your own exports, etc. So if anything comes to mind during the presentations, pop it in the chat box. We'll come to it at the end. Or if you've got any other questions, then please just take yourself off camera at the end and ask away as well. We are recording the presentation. The slides will be sent round from both speakers afterwards. So yeah, just want to hand over to Jim, and he'll take you through the first presentation. Over to you, Jim.
Thank you, Mel. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. It's 6 a.m. for me. I'm in Loveland, Colorado today, so not my usual digs. But it's hard to believe with everything we've been talking about with tariffs that it's only been 7 months since all this madness started. But it has only been 7 months since all this madness started. And so in certain ways, we might be coming to the end of this first cycle and about to embark on a new one. So before I really dig into my presentation here, I'm going to caveat this by saying that I am not an attorney and I am not an economist either. And so, as I have said to many people before, that if anybody tells you exactly what's going on, that they know exactly what's going to be happening, over the next 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, they're probably selling you something. Because really the only thing that's going on right now is a prime example of the law of unintended consequences. But my last bullet here, I think it's important to note that what we are now dealing with is really no longer a legal exercise. It's more of a political exercise. Excuse me, I'm also getting a little bit of a cold today, so apologies if I croak at you. But what I mean by that is that there's the legal framework that sets up tariffs and trade agreements between countries, but then there's the political framework of leaders and countries negotiating with each other. And this is where things are getting a little dicey because we are in some respects operating outside of the bounds of what the US would traditionally have considered law, but many countries have kind of, cut their own deals with President Trump, and they've sort of come to this détente broadly in the attempt to avoid more severe tariffs or more severe trade barriers. And so even as the law continues to shift in the United States, it's sort of unclear the implications that will have for any given country who is exporting to the US, because the leadership of that country, in your case, Prime Minister Starmer, may decide, okay, it makes more sense to stick with the deal that I've cut rather than whiplash back and forth and change things and then change them again and then cut a new deal and then do a new thing. So this is sort of another aspect of nobody really knows what's going to happen, because even once the law is more settled, there may be political considerations that continue to muddy the waters a bit. So a couple of weeks ago, November 5th, the U.S. Supreme Court heard arguments on what is called the IEEPA tariffs. And the IEEPA tariffs are those global, quote unquote, reciprocal tariffs that impose the 10% tariff on the UK and the 15% tariff on the EU. Well, if you paid attention to any of the news coverage, you will know that that was not a good day for the government's attorneys. The Supreme Court justices asked some very pointed questions as to what the basis for imposing these tariffs was, and what the implications of them were. And all of the betting markets, like Poly Market, swung from it being a 50-50 shot that the Supreme Court would strike them down to now it's about 80-20. Last I checked, that everybody is expecting the Supreme Court to strike down the IEEPA tariffs. So what happens if that is the case? Well, amongst other things, anybody who has imported product into the US since April 2nd is most likely going to be due a refund. So if you are acting as your own importer in the US, that is a refund that you might be able to claim. If you're selling through an importer, your importer would be able to claim it. If you're selling directly to a retailer or a wholesaler, they would be able to claim it. Whether or not exporters see any of that money is kind of going to be specifically up to your situation and the agreements you have with people that are bringing your product into the US. And this was done on a fast track basis, so a ruling is expected anytime between the end of this month and the end of the year. Nobody's really expecting the Supreme Court to sit on this until next summer, which is when they would normally announce the results of major cases from this term. So if you're not familiar with the IEEPA tariffs, just to give you a basis of what they currently cover and what is impacted in this potential ruling, it is the 10% reciprocal tariff and then the higher tariffs on other places. That may also impact you in other ways because folks who are doing product that is primarily sourced from another country. So if you're bringing in, product from North Africa or product from Asia and repackaging it and then selling it as a UK product, those country of origin rules may have bitten you, and you might already be familiar. You might already have to be paying a higher tariff based on the country of origin of the majority of your product. But in addition to those tariffs, this was also cited as the basis for the revocation of what was called the de minimis exemption. There was an exemption of up to $800 in value that could come in without tariff, and it was intended for sort of small parcels ordered by individual consumers in the US. The basis for imposing these tariffs was a set of declared emergencies, such as the trade deficit, and in other areas, everything. These emergencies have been declared for a whole bunch of things, including just purely political things of disagreements with the leader of another country. And so the case that challenged these IEEPA tariffs also challenged the legality of these arbitrary emergencies, but it's less clear whether the Supreme Court is even going to rule on that at all. They may just dodge that question entirely and say, nope, you can't use IEEPA for this, which has other forward-looking implications if they do decide to just kind of dodge that issue entirely. This is the basis of most, but not all, of the tariffs that have been imposed in the U.S. since President Trump came back into office. It's worth focusing on the de minimis exemption for a moment because I know that many UK exporters were doing direct B2C fulfillment where you were accepting orders from consumers in the US and shipping directly to them. And so unlike the sort of squishiness of the rest of the IEEPA tariffs, that $800 exemption is actually written into current law in the United States. It set up this conflict of laws situation where President Trump tried to use IEEPA to essentially cancel out the small parcel exemption. There's a separate case pending about this, but if IEEPA is determined not to do this, then it'll pretty much wipe this out as well. However, the budget bill, which they called the One Big Beautiful Bill that was passed a couple of months ago, does formally repeal the de minimis exemption, but according to the law, that does not take effect until July 1st, 2027. So for the next 18 months or so, that small parcel exemption is still the basis of the law. Now, pretty much everyone in the US who is politically involved with this does agree that the de minimis exemption needs to change or be ended regardless. And the reason is those Chinese retailers like Temu and Shine that are sort of flooding the global market with rock bottom priced goods. From 2015, since it was changed to $800 up until 2025, there was a 900% increase in de minimis exemption packages coming into the US. And while the vast majority of that is like Temu and Shine and AliExpress and things like that, it also happens to be that, according to CBP statistics, 98% of drug seizures and 97% of intellectual property theft seizures were coming in on de minimis exempt packages, and about 70% of those packages originated from China or Hong Kong. So there's certainly a rationale that something about the de minimis exemption needs to change. So if you were shipping directly into the US, you might have a break coming up where particularly lower value products, say under $200, there's a high probability that that exemption will be reestablished in some way, shape, or form. But I would not count on the full $800 coming back into effect ever. Now, one of the things to consider, I mentioned to you, this is a political exercise, not a legal one as much as anything. The de minimis exemption and the elimination of it, elimination is very unpopular. The de minimis exemption was very popular with US consumers. And according to shipping statistics, greater than 50% of those shipments were destined to low income postal codes. So US consumers weren't using this just to buy, cheap Chinese things. They were using it for buying their sort of, daily needs and children's clothing and toys and things like that. So there is a sort of political argument that something is going to come back for this. It's also worth mentioning the UK-US trade deal from May 2025, because as I mentioned to you, the UK may be incentivized to stick to that deal. Certainly President Trump is going to want Starmer to adhere to the terms of the deal, regardless of what happens to the IEEPA tariffs. However, that deal was not ratified by Congress or Parliament. And if the IEEPA tariffs are deemed invalid, it's complicated how that deal would be enforced, even if the UK intended to stick by it. And the reason is that, contrary to the White House's marketing team, tariffs are paid by the importer. They're not paid by the exporter. And so essentially Customs and Border Protection is collecting a tax on US resident businesses or US citizens. And if that law is struck down, it's not clear how Customs and Border Protection would actually collect that fee. So UK manufacturers and US importers are kind of caught in the middle of this without clear guidance, where if some of these deals stick, well, what do we do about them? Nobody knows. So what comes next? Let's look forward into a future world where theoretically the Supreme Court does strike down the IEEPA tariffs. Well, there are 4 other legal bases that the US administration can use to impose tariffs. Section 232 is what's called the national security tariff. It applies by sector. So it's not like I'm going to tariff everything from the UK. It actually requires that it be applied to, steel or aluminum, or it could be applied to food or automobiles. But it is applied by sector and requires an investigation, a Commerce Department investigation. And so they've already imposed a number of these, most notably in the US on metals and lumber. Wood. However, they are imposing it on other things. There was an anti-dumping investigation against Italy for pasta. There might be a 93% tariff on Italian pasta coming into the US in the near future, and that was under Section 232. One thing that UK exporters do need to be aware of with the metals tariffs is that right now the way the Section 232 metals tariff on aluminum was written is that when it comes to products like cans, it only covered empty cans and beer. So if you're exporting empty cans or beer, you already know about this. However, there's a proposal before right now to expand that to all canned beverages. So if you are a beverage importer or a beverage exporter in the UK in the near future, you might have to break out by value the aluminum content of your product versus the beverage content of your product. And so the aluminum content by value would be tariffed at 25%, and the beverage content would be tariffed at whatever the tariff ends up being, whether it's 10%, 0, or something in between. And so that's just basically going to be more paperwork, given the de minimis value of aluminum in a canned beverage. 25% on that aluminum value is not going to be a major hit to your importer, but it is something to be aware of. The next one is Section 301 on unfair trade. And there are some limits to this. There's other downsides in using this, but basically, if the administration decides that a country is trading unfairly with the US, they can impose tariffs of up to 50%. There's sort of a squishy definition of what unfair is, and there's already been some indication that things like the UK digital services tax could be targeted on this basis if they wanted to go down that route. Same thing with the EU. There's many bases that this will be challenged under the law again. So, we could just be getting back on the legal challenge treadmill, but it is something to be aware of where they could reimpose the UK tax if they determine that it's unfair. Now, that has other implications as well, where legally, at least, it sort of tariffs everything uniformly. So if they say we're going to impose, a 10% tax on the UK or a 15% tax on the UK for unfair trade practices, there's not really anything in that law that gives them the power to say, well, we're going to exempt the automobile industry or we're going to exempt the food industry. It would have to be uniform. So we'll see where that goes. Section 122 is what's called the balance of payments crisis, where the president can impose tariffs of up to 15% for 150 days. However, they can only do that for places where we have a balance of payments deficit, which the U.S. does run a balance of payments deficit with most of the world, but coincidentally, the U.S. runs a trade surplus with the UK. So while this is the authority that most people expect the president to use to reimpose tariffs on a lot of East Asia and other places if the IEEPA tariffs are struck down, it would be challenging for them to use this one against the UK because you don't meet the criteria for that law. And last but not least, there's Section 338, which is a 100-year-old tariff called the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. It was never invoked, and because of the World Trade Organization and other laws that have been put in place after then, it was always sort of assumed that this was a dead law. No one ever bothered to take it off the books, but it's basically superseded by other laws. And so no one would have expected this one to be imposed. Like the IEEPA tariffs, if it is, it sets up a conflict of law situation where you can expect immediate lawsuits. And we get back on the treadmill, and 7 months from now, we'll be talking about that. But there's a lot of political downsides to them pulling the trigger on this one, because while it is probably the most flexible option available to them, like IEEPA, it is subject to the exact same downsides that are likely to get IEEPA struck down. And it's politically risky, because if you've ever seen the 80s movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off, most Americans couldn't tell you anything about trade policy and tariffs, but everyone over the age of 35 pretty much has seen Ferris Bueller's Day Off and Ben Stein talking about the Smoot-Hawley tariffs and how they worsened the Great Depression. The political ads basically write themselves for the midterm elections if they decide to pull the trigger on using Section 338 for tariffs. So the takeaway from this is, if you've ever been to Disney World, well, Mr. Toad's Wild Ride continues, because even if the IEEPA tariffs are struck down, this is certainly not the end of the line, and more turmoil is to come. So as exporters, what should you do? Well, first, create your own certainty. Presume these 10% tariffs are here to stay. There may be turmoil in the meanwhile, and if the Supreme Court strikes this down, any temporary reductions or a refund, you can consider it as a windfall. But if you haven't negotiated terms for something like this with your importer of record, you certainly should consider doing so, and doing so soon, because if you've shared the burden with your importer, if you've decided, well, okay, we'll take half and you take half, we'll lower our price 5%, but you pay the other 5% or something like that. If they get a refund, does your agreement with them entitle you to a chunk of that refund on this or any future tariffs? And so that is something you should consider, and something you should write into any agreements that you have with your U.S. importer. Price accordingly. When these tariffs first came out, a lot of retailers made noise about, well, we're not going to accept any price increases. Albertsons is a big chain in the U.S. that was one of the loudest to come out and say, we expect our manufacturers and importers to eat this. We are not going to accept a price increase. Well, that strategy went over like a lead balloon, and almost immediately Albertsons started having empty shelves as manufacturers just stopped shipping to them. You're not going to be reasonable about this. Well, I'm not going to lose money on you. You don't get my product. While Albertsons publicly is still maintaining a very patriotic carry the flag stance, they have sent out feelers to pretty much all of their international customers and been like, we understand this is a difficult time, and if you have to take a price increase, please submit this form to us and we're happy to discuss with you. So everyone is being realistic about this. Prices in the US are going up. But I believe I said this to folks in June when I talked to the FDEA. If you have not yet taken a price increase and you're considering doing so, you really need to do it very soon, because with all the turmoil that's coming, potential Supreme Court, potential new tariffs and things coming in, changes in the law, anybody who has already adjusted their pricing and is able to stick to it for the next year or 18 months is in a good position. But we get past the point where the Supreme Court makes a decision, strikes down the law. We don't know what's going to replace it. I would anticipate that retailers will harden their position again and go back into negotiation mode. So it could become difficult to take a price increase in the future if you haven't already done so. So I would consider that. And last but not least, look into tariff minimization strategies. The Opal Group, as you know, is a back office service provider. We run all of the back office operations for international companies who want to open up US entities and essentially become their own importer. Well, if you have your own US entity, you can essentially use your cost of goods sold at the dock in the UK as your value for import purposes in the transfer pricing. So it dramatically decreases your cost basis for these tariffs get applied to. Changing your Incoterms. If you're currently, shipping to the U.S. DDP, that full invoice price is subject to the tariff when it hits the U.S. However, if you can negotiate with your importer and switch to like Xworks Incoterms, well, then all of those costs and everything else that gets pulled out of the price and is not subject to tariff because that is an expense paid by the U.S. importer. So, just by changing around some of this simple stuff, you can actually minimize your tariffs pretty dramatically, and there's a lot of other things you can do as well. And last but not least, I think it's worth talking about why would you even bother doing this? Well, the U.S. is still a gigantic market, and even with the economic turmoil, we may be going into something that the economists are calling a barbell recession or a K-shaped recession. And what does that mean? Well, it basically means that there's not a uniform behavior in the economy. You've got this split where higher income consumers are actually continuing to spend or even accelerate their spending, whereas lower end consumers and lower income households are really being squeezed and are becoming extremely price sensitive. So there's this split that we're seeing where if you're selling a lower end commodity product, you're really getting squeezed on price. But if you're selling a higher end product, you're probably still doing pretty well. We have not seen a material impact on sales for premium or super premium products. In fact, some folks in our portfolio have even been growing through all this turmoil. So it is something to understand where that higher income population in the U.S. is actually larger than the entire UK market entirely. U.S. retailers on that lower end are also expanding premium private label. So if you're willing to do private label, there's a huge opportunity right now. All of the major U.S. retailers are looking to expand their lines. They're looking for supplier diversification to sort of spread out the impact of tariffs. So there's a lot of opportunities there. If you have a product that can be co-packed, there's actually a lot of opportunities now for attractively priced U.S. co-packing. And last but not least, UK and Commonwealth products do well in the U.S. Australian products, New Zealand products, Canadian products, UK products. They're trusted. It's a trusted brand, and they're attractive to U.S. consumers. So if you can find a path through the turmoil and sharpen your pencil on the spreadsheet, there is still an enormous opportunity in the U.S., but it does require a change in strategy, a change in tactic from what you have been doing previously. So that's the update. I think we're going to do Q&A at the end.
Yeah.
So please feel free to type anything in the chat or send it to Mel.
Yeah.
And otherwise, thank you very much. And I'll turn it back over to Mel.
Thanks, Jim. That's a lot of tariff information and political talk for 6 a.m. at your time. But no, that's really a really good summary. So I'm going to hand over to Gary now, just because I want to make sure that there's a bit of time for questions afterwards. So over to you, Gary.
So let's see if we can get full screen. Yeah, there we go.
Perfect. Yeah, lovely.
Okay. So hello everybody. Big thanks first of all to Phil for Jim, I'm sorry, for making sense of the chaos. I think everybody's aware that there's been a huge amount of disruption in terms of international trade that's been caused by these tariff moves, and also the changes that have happened to things like the FDA. I think really just continuing the topic for today of disruption, I'd like to explain to you a little bit about the principal changes that have occurred with regard to the FDA, which you will all know is the regulatory body that controls and regulates the importation of all foods and beverages into the USA. The FDA's really has been, over the last 10 years in particular, a very proactive organization. It's interesting to see what changes that have been made by the Trump administration kind of affect that proactive stance, how much it's perhaps limited what activities the FDA has in place. So I just wanted to give you a summary of the principal changes to FDA services that have come about over the first 3 quarters of 2025. And I think this really started with the appointment of Robert Kennedy Jr. To Secretary of Health and Human Services in February. So the Health and Human Services Division of the US government is the overarching body that has the FDA within it. And the appointment of Robert Kennedy, I think, caused quite an amount of consternation, given his controversial views on food safety regulation, nutrition, ultra-processed foods, additives, colors, and ingredients. I think he has also some quite interesting opinions on things like raw milk, which is something of a kind of interstate issue in the USA at the moment. But suffice to say that his appointment was a little bit concerning to most people in the food industry sector. So his appointment was actually followed by quite quickly by extensive cuts to the FDA workforce. Not clear if that was his plan or part of the general cuts to government services that were brought in by the Trump administration. So a little later, after his appointment, the Trump administration's drive to cut deficits with certain trading blocks also led to the ending of the de minimis procedure that Jim was referring to earlier on. This in turn caused considerable disruption in international trade, again, as Jim has mentioned there, but particularly for B2C exporters, from the UK. A lot of smaller food and beverage companies that have found a big market in the USA by sending small B2C consignments direct to consumers in America. So we'll look at these changes individually. Between January and September, the FDA experienced significant staff reductions, notably a mass layoff of around 3,500 employees in April, which represented around about 15 to 20% of the FDA's workforce. The layoffs led to immediate problems, including missed court-ordered deadlines for public records, an inability for inspectors to book travel for crucial foreign inspections, and disruptions to important research and clinical trials. The decision to actually rehire a lot of employees was prompted by severe operational issues within the FDA, from pressure from industry, and they were concerned, obviously, about the cuts that would delay approvals of such things as medical devices and public health programs. The FDA quickly rehired key personnel, including teams of medical device reviewers, staff who book travel for safety inspectors, a lot of food scientists and employees whose expertise in infant formula and chemical safety was indispensable, and workers who processed public records. The ending of the de minimis import procedure in the US has caused widespread disruption, leading to increased costs, significant delays, and operational complexities for carriers, and a re-evaluation of e-commerce supply chains. Shipments that were previously exempt are now subject to formal import customs clearance processes or procedure and the payment of import duty. Exporters are faced with the unexpected need to increase prices or to pass on additional costs to their customers. Major parcels carriers like UPS, FedEx, and DHL were caught out by the sudden volume of packages requiring full customs clearance and the huge administrative problems of requesting and getting payment of import duties. UPS actually admitted to a huge pileup of packages that could not be cleared and having to dispose of thousands of those packages. One US importer, speaking to NBC News, complained of having $150,000 worth of inventory at risk of disposal. So whilst the ending of the de minimis procedure has been a big problem for all exporters of low value consignments, it's been even more of a problem for exporters of foods, beverages, and supplements. And this is because these goods are now subject to a formal customs clearance procedure. In particular, because FDA regulated products previously flew under the radar and escaped scrutiny by the FDA. A large proportion of those de minimis consignments that have been going into the USA over the last 10 years have flown under the radar because there was not a formal customs clearance procedure. In a formal customs clearance procedure, FDA regulated products are flagged up to the FDA, meaning flying under the radar is a thing of the past. In an effort to maintain their US sales, a lot of B2C exporters have been forced to explore alternative supply chain arrangements, such as shipping consignment stocks to a US 3PL, such as fulfillment by Amazon, or pivoting to B2B sales to retailers or distributors, or even establishing their own US sales and distribution companies, as Jim referred to earlier. Notwithstanding the changes to the FDA and to the de minimis procedure, it is well to keep in mind that the risks of being found to be non-compliant are ever present. As this graph shows, the FDA continues to focus on enforcing food safety requirements in particular, either by inspecting facilities or by examinations at ports and airports of entry. So, just to summarize the situation as it is at the moment, as it continues to be, this is just a little collage of compliance requirements to remind everyone of the regulations that food and beverage companies must be aware of if they're planning to ship their products to the USA. We're actually frequently contacted by exporters who've had consignments detained due to compliance failings. In fact, yesterday, I was helping a UK confectionery trader who had a full container load of products detained by the FDA. It was in fact detained in clearance initially. This was because the manufacturer's registration was invalid. Simple fact, simple thing that you've got to be sure of before you ship your products to the USA. The fact that the manufacturer's registration number was invalid meant that the manufacturer had to urgently re-register with the FDA. Now, anybody who is registered with the FDA knows that that is more than a same-day activity, taking 2 or 3 days. Now, this means basically that that container load of confectionery is sitting in a US port for the next few days, waiting to be cleared by the FDA, incurring demurrage and frustration on the part of the exporter and the seller of the goods. To make matters worse, it turns out that this particular consignment was being shipped to fulfillment by Amazon. Now, this meant that the customs broker, or means that the customs broker, once he's dealt with the registration problem and getting that cleared by the FDA, will have to be asking the exporter for their FSVP agent requirement details. Now, I don't know if everybody is familiar with FSVP agent, but it's a requirement for food and beverage consignments that are shipped unsold to the USA to companies like Amazon. Simply because Amazon doesn't buy them, it simply stores and distributes, sells them in the USA. Now, the exporter knows nothing about this, and we have had to explain to that exporter that they can't now get their goods cleared in the USA because it's impossible for a company like Registrar Corp to act as FSVP agent for a company who has already shipped their products to America. The FSVP agent service can only be provided to a company before they ship the products to America. Now, this company is going to be faced with the dilemma that as they can't get their goods cleared into America, they are going to either have to have them returned to the sender, or possibly may have to be destroyed, a whole container load of products. Either way, it's going to be very expensive to do one or the other. And their only option currently is to try to persuade a US company to buy those products from them and to deal with that FSVP requirement. As you can imagine, the costs and time lost in this type of situation are huge, and all because of a simple lack of preparation and a simple error in compliance procedures. So what I wanted to do quickly before going off is just remind everybody about the basics, first of all, of shipping food and beverage into the USA. There are three basic requirements. The first thing is that the manufacturer of the goods needs to be registered with the FDA as a food facility. The second thing is that prior notice has to be submitted to the FDA before the goods arrive in America, and that prior notice must include the manufacturer's registration number. This is the FDA's way of ensuring that all goods coming into the USA are from a manufacturer that has been registered with the FDA. And the last basic requirement is the labeling of the products. Now, everybody, I think, will know that US labeling is very different than UK or European labeling. And you absolutely must get your labeling compliant before you start shipping your products into the USA. Now, the risks of being found to be non-compliant are the driving factor as to why you need to look at regulation and to comply with it. And the risks with the FDA arise at the ports and airports of arrival in America. That is the absolute point of risk for you if you're exporting products to the USA. The FDA randomly inspects goods arriving at ports and airports. And as in this case of the confectionery company, if you fall down in terms of one little compliance requirement, you may find that your whole compliance procedure is being scrutinized by the FDA with a microscope to make sure that everything is in order. Once you come to the FDA's attention, you can be sure that they will, in the old English phrase, come down on you like a ton of bricks. So I will, just before finishing, mention a couple of additional requirements that food and beverage companies need to know about, and that is that there are certain products like low acid and acidified foods. You can see examples of those at the bottom of the screen. There's an additional layer of FDA regulation applying to those. So if there's any idea or suspicion that your products are low acid or acidified foods, check that out first of all to make sure that your products are or are not covered by that regulation. And the last thing to mention, and I referred to it earlier, is that if you are selling food and beverage products into the USA, if you're shipping them unsold to a fulfillment service provider, you should be aware that as with this case I mentioned to you, you will be asked by the customs broker for FSVP agent details. The background to this is that the FDA requires all US commercial buyers of foods and beverages to create foreign supplier verification programs to make sure that the products in question have been manufactured by a company who complies with FDA food safety plan requirements. So this is the way, the FDA's way of ensuring that these products are safe for consumption in the USA. And US buyers, therefore, of foods and beverages from foreign suppliers are obliged to create these programs where they verify and monitor the compliance of the foreign supplier in terms of food safety plans. However, when goods arrive in America unsold, there is no US buyer to come forward to the customs broker to deal with these FSVP importer requirements. In those circumstances, the FDA says that the foreign supplier, being the continuing owner of the goods, needs to take on that responsibility. However, bizarrely, the foreign supplier can't do that because they're not a US company. And in those circumstances, they have to appoint a US company, like Registrar, company that I work for, to act as FSVP agent. Now, we can act as FSVP agent for companies, but we have to first of all approve the manufacturer involved, their food safety plans, the products involved, and the labeling before we put our neck on the line to guarantee to the FDA that the manufacturer is compliant with FDA requirements. So we can only do that if we scrutinize the food safety plans and all the other details of the products and labels before the goods are shipped to America. So it's important to know about before you start sending products to it. Amazon, as the case that I cited earlier explains. So that's me for today. Perhaps we can open the conversation up to any questions and answers.
Thanks, Gary. Yeah, if anybody does have any questions for Jim or Gary, if you want to pop yourself off mute, or if you've got anything to add for how your business has been going, please do feel free to comment. If you want to put your hand up, you can do that as well.
I'll add one thing to that last bit Gary was saying about foreign supplier verification programs. If you are doing a lot of U.S. business and you decide to create your own U.S. entity, you open up a U.S. company. Oddly enough, your U.S. company can actually serve as your foreign supplier verification act for your parent company in the U.K. Now, you need a registered agent to still certify that compliance, but it's actually you can serve as your own agent coming into the U.S. With some paperwork. So it's worth noting. If people are looking at strategies moving forward.
Yeah, I totally agree, actually, Jim. And it is one of the things that I suggested to that company that I was speaking with yesterday. They actually have a US company, so that kind of provides them with an out, if you wish, in this particular occasion, as long as that US company has permanent offices and permanent employees. That's one of the fundamental requirements for acting as an FSVP importer. And yeah, that's a solution. But again, you've got to be dealing with that before you send the shipment to Amazon.
Yeah, I think it sounds resounding that, you have to be prepared before you send anything out. And it's great that, Registrar Corp and the Opal Group are there that can provide help to members as well. So yeah, do get in touch with them.
I would mention that I've seen recently this fulfillment model as being kind of expanded quite a lot. I was at an event in London recently where Walmart are now offering fulfillment services as part of their Walmart marketplace platform. And I heard recently as well that I've seen recently that TikTok is doing the same thing.
Yeah.
So, and I get the feeling as well that there's quite a lot of independent 3PLs in America that are offering this service. Either companies that have a kind of marketing platform of some kind. I think Fair is one of those. I don't know
Hmm. Yeah.
whether that's the same thing. Um, but
Fair is a
it's
little
very
different. I'll just mention Fair is a little different. They where most of these fulfillment houses are B2C, Fair is actually a wholesale
yeah.
consignment group. So their Fair is a way to get into a whole variety of like smaller retailers. Like that's where you can start tackling the corner store market or the bodega market in New York City, that type of thing.
Okay, I understand. Yeah. Well, I've been struck recently by how many fulfillment services are coming about, if I can put it that way. But we've had a huge amount of inquiries from companies that have been smaller companies, people like the chocolate suppliers and things like the artisan chocolates and biscuits and confectionery and personalized things that who've had a fabulous growth in America, uh, market selling B2C um, through the de minimis scheme, and everything has come crashing down. Literally, in
Yeah.
the last few weeks, we've had companies that are closing their storefront on Amazon or something like this. We even found a company that was shipping de minimis to Amazon, which was a bit, yeah, it, it was crazy. But suffice to say, actually, that um, that kind of door has been firmly shut, um, and people have had to be fast on their feet to, if they want to maintain their US market. You've got people here that have been shipping thousands of small packages into the USA over the last 10 years or so, and have never been caught out
Right.
by the FDA. They never had to bother with, they never bothered with prior notice. They've never had to they've never got their manufacturing facilities registered, and they haven't done anything about labeling. And now they are faced with having to ship in consignment stocks um, to a fulfillment service provider, and on top of now having to deal with those basics all all at once, they've got to get their manufacturer registered, they've got to get their labeling right, they've got to do the prior notice for every shipment they send. Now they've got to get this FSVP agent thing sorted as well. Um,
Mm.
so it really is a big challenge. I saw
Yeah.
on one day at the Walmart exhibition, we had 43 inquiries from companies in that position. So
Yeah, it's a problem. It is.
yeah,
Please,
yeah,
please,
Yeah.
please, 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 I beg all of you, before you start shipping to Walmart Marketplace or any of the other ones, you don't have to hire us, but talk to me, talk to Gary, talk to Steve, who I see has his hand up. Talk to
Yeah.
someone who is experienced at doing business in the US because you can get way out over your skis on those programs.
yeah.
Yeah. Steve, I'm going to
Steve,
bring you into the conversation. Steve's our, if for those of you that don't know Steve, another one of our in-market partners in the US. Hi, Steve.
Great. Thanks, Jim and Gary. Super interesting information. Appreciate that. Just a quick question. I've heard some possible strategy to deal with some of the tariff situation is that the tariffs are supposedly calculated on raw materials. And so you can calculate the tariff on the raw material if you can somehow calculate that. So you take out whatever is considered not raw material and you calculate the tariff on that, which can bring down the tariff significantly. It's kind of the word on the street that I've heard, although this came from a lawyer, although he said, I don't advocate this, it's just what I've heard. Have you guys heard that strategy at all? And have you had any experience with that strategy? Would love to know if that's something that might make sense.
So I feel like that is one of those game of telephone things where it's kind of half right and half wrong. Um, so country of origin rules still apply. So like if you are a tea seller, for instance, if you're essentially just bringing in Chinese tea, um, and putting it in a package and then shipping it to the US, that's not country of origin UK, that's country of origin China, and the Chinese tariff would apply. If you're bringing it in and you're blending it with three other places and then shipping it out, well, then the blended by value would apply. But on the other hand, if you're actually bringing it in and transforming it in some way, you're adding other non-tea ingredients, you're packaging it in tea bags, then there is a certain line you can cross where all of a sudden that becomes country of origin UK, and then the UK tariff would apply to that. Now, what the Customs and Border Protection Agency has settled on to deal with these tariffs is what they're effectively calling the first sale doctrine. So this kind of goes to what Gary was saying as well about selling to like an FBA or some other 3PL who does not take ownership of the product, where you sort of get into a gray area where if you're working through an importer, the price you sell to your importer, that first bona fide sale, is the value that it will be tariffed on. Now, where it gets a little weird is like, say for instance, you're selling in the UK to a distributor, and that distributor is then exporting it to the US. Because that distributor purchased the product from you with the intent to export, they don't have to export it at their price for tariff purposes. They can export it at the price they bought it from you, that first bona fide sale doctrine. Where it gets really messy is if you as a manufacturer selling to a 3PL who is not taking ownership of the product, and then they're just selling it on to someone else, technically you have to sell it at that wholesale price where it is actually being marked to market. And people are playing all kinds of games where they're like, well, this is how much I think they're marking it up, so I'm going to take 20% off this and then do that, and the other thing. You might get away with it a few times, but like
Yeah.
Gary said, if they ever scrutinize that, they're going to come
Right.
down on you like a ton of bricks. So you
There's
got to
one,
be very careful about that.
Jim, there's just one thing I'd mention actually, and something I've realized over the last few years is that British companies in particular really we deal with an awful lot with brand owners, if I can put it that way. In other words, the Brits seem to be very good at creating products, if you wish, and marketing them. But there are very a lot less manufacturers in the UK these days than before. So a lot of these brand owners in the UK have been very successful with their products, but in a lot of cases they actually source those products from foreign suppliers. So this company that I was speaking to the other day about yesterday about this container load that was held up in the States, those products actually came from Belgium. Now they didn't come from the UK, but I do know that a lot of food industry companies source brand owners source their products from China, for example. Now, in that case, or at least countries outside the UK. So those companies have got to absolutely be aware with these new tariff situation about the origin of the products that they are selling into the USA. We had a company the other day. It's a supplements company. Admittedly, it's not a food product as such, but they are just we're hoping to source their products from China. Currently, they're made in the UK, but that's now heading the whole situation is now pushing them back towards their UK manufacturer. So, kind of good news for UK manufacturers. Bad news for Chinese manufacturers.
Yeah, it's a bit of a grey area that when, you know, you've got different products originating in different markets. Well, I'm aware of the time, it's 2 o'clock, so I'm just going to say thank you to our speakers. It's been a very insightful session. And yeah, as always, I'm sure 6 months the situation will have changed again and we'll need another one of these to catch up on what's happening. But yes, thank you very much for joining us. Thanks, Jim, for getting up very early and logging on and delving into all sorts of things, tariffs so early in the morning. Like I said, we will share the slides and the recording with everybody as well. So thank you very much, everyone, and
Thanks,
have a
guys.
great day. Thank you.
See you
Thank
soon.
you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.